On Thursday, September 8, 2011, U.S. Senator Mike Enzi sat down in his office to share his thoughts and memories of 9/11 and what the 10-year anniversary meant to him. He also shared stories that constituents had shared with him and their memories of that fateful day.
Well, I was in my office getting ready for a hearing that was going to be a featured speaker of First Lady Laura Bush talking about reading literacy. I had to make a phone call to a person that advises me on a lot of safety things, Ron Hayes, who has done some seminars in Wyoming to help out families that have lost people, advises me a lot on OSHA. And so I was returning a call to him. I turned on the television to make sure that the room hadn't been changed where we were going to hold the hearing. And when I turned it on, there was a plane in the World Trade Center. And I said to Ron Hayes, I said, there's a plane in the World Trade Center. He said, yeah, I know, but I really needed to talk to you about this safety thing. And just at that time, a second plane came into the World Trade Center, and I said, I gotta go, something bad's happening. And just then a security guard stuck his head in the door and said, you gotta evacuate the building, we're having a problem. So I ducked out the door, and I was herded into a group that was with Laura Bush and taken downstairs, and they were loading us into cars. I said, wait a minute, I've got to find my wife. They said, well, this is going to a secure location. If you don't get in right now, you can't go. So I didn't get in. I went and found my wife, and we worried through the rest of the day together. All the phone lines were jammed up for DC. You couldn't make a telephone call. The cell phones were so busy that the cells were all overworked. But people worked together. Everybody on the Hill was released at the same time. They're usually released over a period of time, so there was a huge traffic jam. But people were sharing rides with people that normally had to take the other kinds of transportation because that wasn't functioning. There were some automobile dealers in town from Wyoming, and I didn't get to meet with them. Nobody got to do any meetings that day. There were no planes flying for several days, so they bought a car and drove it back to Wyoming and sold it after they got there. Just a lot of unique things. One man from Wyoming was up in Alaska hunting, and he was in the bush, and so there was no communication, and then the day he was supposed to be picked up, nobody came to pick him up. And it was several days before anybody picked him up, and he found out what had happened and why his plane wasn't there. He thought he was going to be marooned for a long time. It was a very scary time in Wyoming, and particularly in Washington, D.C. One of my employees had, on her way in, saw the plane go into the Pentagon, and she turned around and went home. Of course, we could see the smoke from our house from the Pentagon, and we're kind of just trying to pick up any news we could. Of course, one of the things that happens in news is that the first reports that you get are usually the most outrageous. So my suggestion always is to kind of turn the TV off for an hour, but that wasn't a time you could turn any TV off for an hour. We learned quite a few things about security, and we learned about communication at that time. We also found out that it wasn't best to stay in a building when something like that might be happening. But then it occurred that when you go outdoors, that could be a setup so that they could have snipers outdoors. Just a lot of new considerations that people in the United States have never had to think about. We became the most patriotic time that I've ever seen in this country. People were hanging flags from their houses, from hotels, from overpasses. There were flags everywhere. Some of them were hand-drawn, some of them were cloth. In New York, we saw pictures of the people applauding those who were going to search through the rubble and saluting the people that were helping out. Of course, all of us were trying to make connections with anybody that might have been up there at that time, and there were some kids, I call them kids, they were young people that were working there. One of them, fortunately, didn't make it to work at the World Trade Center that day. But we were trying to make those kinds of connections. And then, of course, we went to New York and looked at the site up there as soon as it was possible for the Senate to do that. And that was a touching scene. People from all over the country came in to help out. Some people from Wyoming drove out immediately to help out. And we would watch them dig through the rubble. Occasionally they'd find something. If it was human remains, they were very careful with it, and actually marched it out as though it were a special procession to protect it. The people were in danger that were working on this. We watched them move a little bit of rock and saw some yellow gas go up in the air. No idea what it was or how it would affect them, but it didn't matter. They were there helping. There was a sense of community in this country, a real strong sense of community. People, even in New York City, were interested now in who their neighbor was and how their neighbor was doing, and if there was anything they could do to help. And it was a time of getting to know people that people didn't even know before. There was a sense of city. New York, particularly, was the optimum of seeing all of these people worrying, getting together, trying to solve immediate problems that they had with food, water, whatever. But it was also a time of the world coming together. Diane and I had as soon as we were able to move around the city, went to a meeting where there were a whole bunch of ambassadors from other countries. And all of them were very sympathetic to what had happened to the United States. Their outpouring was particularly touching. We had never seen that kind of concern from the rest of the world. The United States has always been the one taking care of the rest of the world. And this was a time when the rest of the world was interested in taking care of the United States and understanding what we'd been through. Now, a little later on, there had been a shift in the Senate in August before the September 11th event. And a spot opened up on the Foreign Relations Committee, and I got that spot. And then they had to readjust committees, and I wound up as a ranking member, even though I was just brand new on the committee, of a subcommittee. And after 9/11, there were a whole bunch of people that wondered why this freshman had this committee, because it was called anti-terrorism. And we became the focal point of the Foreign Relations Committee at trying to figure out what to do about what had happened. I was also a delegate to the United Nations and got to work with a special task force on terrorism that was formed there. And of course, as the accountant, I'm always interested in the money part. And what we were encouraging all of the countries in the world to do was to follow the money. And about 130 countries joined us with that. And through that process, we're able to capture and prosecute a whole bunch of terrorists that could have been a follow-up to what had happened in the United States. But it didn't happen because we had the cooperation of all of these other countries. There were just a very few that didn't actually participate in it. Now, most of them didn't want the world to know that they were doing that. And they have a little different system of justice than we do. But their efforts were really appreciated. Another thing that was expressed by the ambassadors was their appreciation that Bush didn't the next morning fire off missiles in Afghanistan, that he actually checked to see what was going on and put some care and concern into it, talked to other countries to get support, and then took some action in Afghanistan. And they really appreciated that he had that extra concern and ability to check on what was happening before he just fired things off. Billy of Gillette sent me a story sharing the anxiety and fear she felt when the first plane hit the two towers. She had family who were flying into Washington, D.C. that day, and also had a cousin who was stationed at the Pentagon. While her family was safe, her heart still breaks for what happened. And Brian of Grable shared the story of his wife, who happened to be in Colorado Springs, Colorado, when the attacks happened. Hearing that the president might be headed to NORAD and that there was the potential for more attacks, she hopped the first bus to her in-laws' house in Cody. She'd never been to Wyoming and didn't know what to expect. While most of the ride was in the dark, she awoke to sunrise inside the Wind River Canyon. Brian said it's a day that we all should remember and never forget how the way country bonded together. We were all Americans on that day, and we should always be able to treat everyone that way. And I think that's a grand sentiment. I would like to see that sense of community, that sense of country, that sense of the world come out of this tragedy, the chaos, the devastation that happened then. can give us a hope for the future. We overcame that. It can be the name for the next generation, the iconic moment.